And then we get to this idea of open process. Oh my goodness. Well, if it wasn't an open process, I get news for you folks, you wouldn't even know half the stuff you know about it. Everything was put up on the web. Now, this is information has been totally misused and abused by people that know better. But to say we're going to have a brainstorming session and someone says, well, how does mass transit figure into this? So someone writes that down on a sheet. Well, how does housing figure into this? And they write it down on a sheet. And that draft document of all the things that were kind of thrown out ends up in the public eye. To go from that to the conclusion that this group was assembled to promote mass transit is not only silly, but it's beneath the level of intelligence of folks that are weighing in on the subject. More importantly, to make it clear when the issue did come up, this board took an affirmative step in my direction or my suggestion to implement a very clear direction as to what our policy was on mass transit, and yet we have the same folks beating the same drum. So the bottom line is this. This was nothing more than my attempt, as other commissioners have done in groups of 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, to get an idea of, do we need to have a process to assess these kinds of things long term? If you did, who are the people you'd want involved in the discussion? I think these are a good subset of the folks. Any process has got to be public for it to be valid. I totally agree with that. I have more town halls and public meetings than any other commissioner in the entire last board, maybe more than any commissioner combined. No one has been out there more public than I have. And now what they're saying is, let's have a public process. Let's have a discussion. If you want to do that, that's fine. But to apply these misinformation that this was secret, the misinterpretation that these folks were somehow conspiring to do something, or that there is some preordained plan or vision or something else, is nothing short of ludicrous, self-serving, and political. And that's what I wanted to say.
Well, thank you, Mr. Howard. And I, as mentioned, I have a brief PowerPoint I'd like to give to the public and to the Board of Commissioners for their consideration that addresses some of the legal implications of this. Chris, I'll ask you to come out and run this thing, please. I want to start by repeating a phrase which is well known in America: the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And the issue here was not an issue when this was a private work group. Certainly, any commissioner can have a private work group. But now there's a discussion whether or not we're going to basically ratify this ex post facto. And when words go into a plan and it's published, it matters. It matters. It can open the county up to lawsuits, for example, by environmental groups. So with that, I'm going to give a very brief presentation. I want to talk about Carroll County's comprehensive master planning process versus Carroll 2030. What you see on the screen is an actual screenshot of the 2030 plan. It says Generation XYZ. Is actually on the Vision 2030 website that was hosted on a government website. Next slide, please. We have a brief video showing the this 2030 visionary, or is it just more planning? Well, it's been around quite a while. Chris, can you play that, please?
Come with me and you will see Vision 2030 Jamaica, the national development plan to make it happen.
It's what Jamaica needs to do
to grow, to mature,
and to become a developed country.
The funding commitments extended by the Chinese government and related development agencies have provided a new lease of life for Vision 2030 flagship projects that have been lagging behind in their development schedule due to lack of funding. With the signing of the agreement,
Vision 2030, an economic program to boost growth and to focus on strategic outcomes for the economy. How well is Vision 2030 currently being pursued?
First 5-year medium-term plan, which is basically the foundational phase where we're going to be setting up all the structures in order to ensure delivery.
Now, what's the point of this? Well, first off, Julia Googe commissioned a Vision 2030 plan in 2001. It didn't go any further than that. Now, some people might try to argue that Vision 2030 is not a comprehensive plan. It's not a comprehensive planning process. But I would argue that it's taken on the characteristics of a comprehensive plan. And there's a saying, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. Next slide. And I've tried to compare them in the two columns, the master plan versus Vision 2030. As you can see, they share certain elements in common: vision statements, present and future trends, public facilities, transportation, housing, and so on and so on. You can see they share these things in common. Next slide. Economic development, land use, implementation strategies, etc. Next slide, please. So what's the problem? Well, comprehensive planning has serious implications and is heavily regulated under the Annotated Code of Maryland to assure open government, proper notification of citizens, accountability, and most importantly, closed-loop mechanisms to implement citizen input. And planning under the Annotated Code is specifically assigned to the Planning and Zoning Commission. Next slide. And I have some excerpts from Planning Code, Section 3201, Plan Preparation, that says, a planning commission shall prepare a plan by carefully and comprehensively surveying and studying, blah, blah, blah. Now, back up a second, Chris. I want to make a key point here. A planning commission is comprised of citizen lay people. They are lay people. We don't create planning commission staff with the head of our libraries, the head of our school systems, the head of our colleges, because all of these organizations have one thing they share in common. They are funded by government. That's why we use lay people, because there's an inherent conflict of interest going in if you staff a planning organization with the people who receive the money they're funding from government. Next slide. And they should plan, the Planning and Zoning Commission under code shall plan in accordance with present and future needs. Present and future needs. There is already a forum for these subgroups to come to the Planning and Zoning Commission and present their views, which raises the question, what problem are we really solving with 2030? Next slide. I would argue that it begins at least to usurp or certainly impinge on the role of the Planning and Zoning Commission, because according to 2030, they were supposed to address water, roads, wastewater, stormwater, affordable housing, broadband connections. There's a level of redundancy here. Redundancy with the Planning and Zoning Commission, redundancy with the Department of Land Use, Planning and Development. Next slide. Carroll County already has official planning resources in place. We've got a Department of Land Use, Planning and Development, Public Works, Citizen Services to address some housing problems here and there, Technology Services, a Regulatory Commission. Next slide. We've got a zillion boards already in place to advise government. And these boards include things like Agricultural Preservation Board, an Agricultural Commission, Department of Social Services, Economic Development Commission, Industrial Development Authority, a local management board, and all of these people have an open door to sit down in front of the Planning and Zoning Commission anytime they want and express their views, whether it's 5 years, 10 years, or 15 years down the road in terms of the planning horizon. And in fact, keep going, the Annotated Code, Section 3201D2, says a planning commission shall consult, not may consult, shall consult with public officials, agencies, public utility companies, civic, educational, professional, and other organizations and citizens about the plan. Shall consult. So the door is there. All we have to do is walk through it with our existing subgroups. Next slide, please. Now, what was in 2030? The problem started to develop late in the process. We heard from the group, and we started to see an attempt move forward to basically ratify it ex post facto after the fact. The problem is that the summaries that I'm seeing published are not what's in the plan. The summaries were what I would call homogenized summaries that were edited and filtered for the public, edited and filtered for the commissioners, and did not accurately reflect what was in sections of this plan, which are many of it still online today. And I want to show people, let me finish, Mr. I didn't interrupt you.
Well, I just
Next slide, please. I'll let you respond. Write it down and I'll let you respond. Political
There
quotes.
is no plan.
There are political quotes from 2030. I want to read some of them. Now, this is supposed to be a plan, not a political platform.
Not a plan.
Quote, transportation system isolates us. Quote, a lack of diversity. These are vision statements. Quote, a lack of appreciation for diversity. Quote, Carroll County slow to change. Quote, special and unique, i.e. Carroll County can mean insulated. And what's the conclusion? Government has no single decision maker. There's no focus, and it was basically an indictment of the commissioner form of government where we debate each other, which leads to better decisions, I think, as opposed to charter government, which was what was promoted in the plan, a move to charter government. These visions are political. They are not planning, and they impeach the credibility of 2030 from the very beginning. Next slide. Here are some of the visions for our neighborhoods. Quote, adequate affordable housing for all socioeconomic levels. Well, I don't need a politically correct dictionary to interpret that. That means Section 8. Vision, develop a current and ongoing smart growth plan. Our citizens have been battered to death by our government over the last 5 years, fighting comprehensive plans that threaten to change the fabric of their neighborhoods. And time and again, our citizens have said, no, we don't want this. Next slide. It advocates a career fire rescue system bolstered by volunteers. This may be the right way to go. This may be the right way to go. But I want to point out, I have 4 municipal towns, incorporated towns in my district. And it's clear to me that the social fabric of our small towns revolve around our volunteer firefighters and their auxiliaries. And one thing that scares me, and it may be the right thing to do, but a move towards paid personnel might jeopardize the fabric of these towns, because our towns wouldn't exist without our volunteer firemen in many ways. And there's a more fundamental question here. Is this an affordable and correct vision for Carroll? Is it affordable? How would we pay for it? Next slide. Farmers beware. The clusters didn't know what each other were doing. The business cluster made a comment, ag preservation, this is I think in the strengths and weaknesses and threats, ag preservation versus commercial residential needs of the county, versus. It positions ag preservation and farming, the cornerstone of our county, as a potential threat to an agenda involving more commercial and more residential development. My constituents came to Carroll County to escape commercial and residential development, not for more of it, not to turn it into another Montgomery County. Next slide. There's a word, advanced transportation. It doesn't say mass, it uses advanced transportation. I asked the question, why do they use euphemisms in this plan? Advanced transportation, rather than just saying what they meant, which is mass transit. And here's what was identified as a weakness within 2030. The transportation system is weak because it is limited inside the county and not connected to other jurisdictions. Well, the group might have viewed that as a weakness, but the people who live in Carroll County view it as a strength. We don't want it. And what 2030 is advocating is the trappings of urbanization and mass transit that our citizens moved here to escape. If they wanted to live in Montgomery County, they would move there. They came here to escape it. Next slide. Now, I just want to make a general question about how democratic processes may be used when groups get together, even if they are sanctioned by a board and vote. This happens in Annapolis all the time. This is just the generic. This is not an indictment of Commissioner Howard.
No, you wouldn't want to do that.
An official staffs a panel with people who agree with him. I put together a panel of people who like Chevys to vote on whether or not Chevys should be the car of choice for government. The panel then engages a democratic process of voting, and magically they conclude that Chevys are the best car. Was there a democratic process? Yes. Was it a railroad job? Yes. Because by choosing the panel members, I stacked it from the beginning. And worldwide, there are terms that are used for this. This is called consensus building or collaborative governments, and they are used around the world as a direct threat to the fully representative protections inherent in a constitutional republic. And most importantly, all of these things in this plan so far advocate an agenda of more spending, and this will lead to more debt. But there's no discussion of that. Next slide. Now, there's an inherent conflict of interest when this was put together from the beginning. What did 75% of the members, 21 of the 28, have in common before they ever joined the 2030 team? Well, all of them were either paid by government or employed by government or got funding from government, and all of them wanted more money from our taxpayers. So it should come as no surprise when a 2030 group provides recommendations for tens of millions of dollars in increased spending. No surprise. It's not a criticism. It's an inherent bias built in. That's why we don't staff a planning and zoning commission with our agency heads. Next slide. And here's some evidence of that within the plan. $5 million for roads, $500,000 for facilities, $16 million for sewer expansion, $20 million for Freedom Sewer, 2,500 more acres of commercial development. Next slide. Another $2 million for transportation. With, I might add, with transfer points at the county perimeter. So they knew that the commissioners would not agree to inter-county transportation, so they positioned this as transfer points at the county perimeter. So they could argue that our transportation system wasn't crossing the boundary perimeter. But this is a direct attempt to circumvent the stated will of the people of Carroll County over and over again. Next slide. There are problems with the plan. It just mentioned things without sensitivity to real-world realities. Increased water and sewer infrastructure. Well, there's a cost. Higher wage base. Well, that's market-driven. Geared to professional services, not retail. That's market-driven. More shovel-ready business park lots. Well, we've done the prior Board of Commissioners did a great job with that. I hope it continues. We've got that underway already. Extending the airport runway, that That ship has sailed. It's going to happen. The board voted to do it, so that's redundant. And charter government to provide stability and leadership to allow business to grow. Well, charter government usually leads to bigger government and higher cost to taxpayers. Next slide. Now let's look at our comprehensive plans on the other hand. They are fully open to the public. They are developed according to law. They are developed with participation of citizens. They are developed by citizens and lay people and open to review and the input of citizens at every step of the process through strict open meetings compliance. And they're subject to oversight and management of the duly elected representatives of the people, the entire Board of Commissioners. Next slide. The Attorney General, the interesting thing along the side here, there was a lot of gnashing of the teeth because the Board of Commissioners tried to insert a 2-page letter in the current master plan. And the town of Mount Airy in November asked for an opinion from the Attorney General, specifically in the event of a significant disagreement between the Town Council and Planning Commission regarding material aspects of a comprehensive plan, does the Council have the authority to adopt material changes? Well, the answer was no. Clearly trying to tie down the authority of the elected body to usurp the rightful legislative planning role under the Annotated Code of Maryland of the Planning and Zoning Commission to make plans. And I believe the Attorney General made the right decision on this. Next slide. A planning commission shall have the powers necessary to enable the commission to fulfill its functions, promoting, planning, and executing the purposes of this division. Next slide. So 2030, who benefits? Well, if I take a planning group and staff it all with government agency heads, it's going to become a process of government by government and predisposed to grow government. Its nature is to advance an agenda of more. 2030 initiatives will require higher taxes and more debt. Yet nowhere is this disclosed or discussed in the plan. The omission of negative information reflects bias in the preparation of the plan. It is serious bias and it is problematic. You can't just talk about all the flowery goals and ignore the fact that all these things come with a price tag because there is no free lunch. Next slide. 2030 will, if it were acted on based on where it is today, would damage the rural fabric of our counties and communities and possibly damage agriculture. And the ex post facto, the after-the-fact adoption of this plan or any of its outcomes, any of its findings, would violate the spirit of the Annotated Code of Maryland and cannot legitimize a process that was tainted from the very, very beginning. And this board must not adopt anything that comes out of 2030, in my judgment, without seeking the opinion of the Attorney General. Better yet, I would suggest that some of the work that came from this group was good. Yes, I've seen some things that did make sense. I've seen some work from Commissioner Wentz. I've seen work on cable. We should encourage those clusters to use the avenues already available to them in the Annotated Code of Maryland and encourage them to get their audience in front of the Planning and Zoning Commission to make their proposals where they can be properly vetted by the properly authorized planning organization under Maryland law. Next slide. Next slide. 2030 is not Carroll County. It is not Carroll County. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Chris.
I'd like to address just a couple of points, and we'll open up for a discussion because it's probably been anything but that, my soliloquy included. First of all, I appreciate Commissioner Rothschild at least acknowledging that there was nothing wrong with my having a planning group of my own. I hope that gets across to some of the folks that he brought here today. This document, any piece of this that's out there, is nothing more than a brainstorming process, some ideas that were generated to see if a process should be put in place, what it might look like. It is not a plan. There is no plan. There has never been a recommendation presented to this board, anything proposed or acted on, nothing. In fact, the whole discussion was it would be highly inappropriate to do that without taking the process back to square one and having an open process that enjoyed the support of the board and open communications. So you can argue with the things that are in there. They were a result of some activities that let some folks brainstorm. And people do ask those questions. And the idea that putting our head in the sand and say, gee, I hope no one asks that question, that doesn't really accomplish too much. People ask those questions, and they're on there, and they're out there for everybody to view. I'm not afraid of someone asking me a public transportation question. You know why? Because I know what the answer is. That's why we did the resolution. I'm not afraid of someone asking me for more money. You know why? Because I know how much we have to spend, and I think I have a pretty good idea that we do a good job of spending it. So that's the first thing. It's not a plan at all. To say it is a plan is just factually incorrect. The The second thing is what we asked this group to do, and the reason why we chose a lot of the leaders in the community in various areas, was to do a needs assessment. And it's this kind of hysterical paranoia that I encountered on the last board that caused me to want to do this on my own. The second year in the budget, I said, well, what if we asked organizations not just what they can do with 5% less, but what could they do with 3 or 4% more? Now, immediately, that's a quick, easy way to say, oh my gosh, he wants to raise taxes, he wants to raise debt, he wants to do whatever. The fact is, I think I got a pretty strong voting record in that, so we can leave that alone. But the issue is, sometimes one organization spending a little bit more to accomplish the same task that another organization is struggling with can actually be a huge savings across the board, like the coordination or combining of facilities. So we didn't want to ask that question. I mean, I was actually told by my colleague, do not, if you do that, the floodgate's going to open, and these crazy folks like our superintendent of schools or head of our community college or library or whatever, they're going to come in here and ask us for money, whatever. The fact is, we said, though, we know that there is more need. If you simply just provide the same level of service, there is more need going forward in a growing community than we have the resource for today. So before we get there and say, okay, what are we going to give up? Or what can't we do anymore? Or boy, we didn't really expect crime to get out of control, or roads to fall in disrepair. Before we get there, doesn't it make sense to say, okay, what's it going to take to get there? How could you do things much more efficiently? Who could work together? What things shouldn't we be doing at all? So that along the way, you don't get to this situation where we're wholly unprepared for the future. Now, nobody wanted to have this discussion other than with the public, and which is why they came here. Now, lastly, this notion that this is somehow interfering with the Planning Commission, I think is a very interesting thing because, again, it's been before this board now 3 times, and that issue was never raised. But this is the flavor du jour. When they couldn't get me on open meetings because it wasn't one, and then we sort of threw out an ethics complaint, even though those are supposed to say confidential, but no one cares about that. And that has gone nowhere because there was nothing to it. On top of that, now we talk about, well, it's going to result in raising taxes, which is the great way to never have a conversation. Make sure you throw that out right up front, and you'll never have a discussion in the community. The fact is, it's a discussion. Now, if it's a discussion the board doesn't want to have, if you don't want to say, hey, just out of curiosity, how many schools do we need in 2015? And maybe it's actually less than the number we have today if we build them right. Who knows? But if you don't want to have that discussion, if you just want to look at grant application after grant application, proposal after proposal, take them one at a time, and hope that 1,000 individual decisions end up with this community being prepared for the future, that's great. It's not what I would do in the private sector. And if I've offended anybody by not being public, well, this board had no tolerance for even these discussions until I think we demonstrated that there was an opportunity to have a real engaged discussion, not that's going to open the flood banks for money, but to say there are going to be tough choices to make. And how do you make those intelligently? And I just think all this fear-mongering and attacking and all that takes away from the discussion. But it does one thing. It proves why I chose to have those conversations with a group of folks when we were talking about what lay ahead for Carroll County. Not what I wanted, not even what they wanted, but what might come about as a result of the trends that we're seeing and the evolution of a growing community. Now, what Jamaica, Abu Dhabi, get me a Bible, I'll swear on it. I had no idea that phrase had even been used. I've never used the phrase Vision 2030, by the way. I've always called it Carroll 2030. I personally have never used it. So whoever just gasped, I have never used it. But I will say this. I did not go to Jamaica or Abu Dhabi or anywhere else to come up with the idea of getting the leaders of our community together and saying, hey, as you look down the road, what are the things we're likely to need? So that's all I want to say about it. Approve it, don't approve it. Fact is, if you don't approve it, I think we've already benefited from it. I just think this is truly the silliest conversation we have had in the 4 years we've been in government. And it is not about not wanting people involved. We're here because we want people involved. Why that point doesn't get across to, sharp people, I don't understand. Do you guys want to say anything before we wrap this conversation up? Can't imagine you would. Would you mind?
The line has already been said. My only, comments would be that I don't see, the harm in having the 2030 report. I don't see what's wrong with looking to the future. I don't see what's wrong with setting goals and seeing how you're going to get to those goals. I think any prudent organization should do that. As everyone knows, I'm a teacher and a coach. My athletes set goals all the time. and we work toward those goals. This is nothing different. You said goals. Do I agree with everything in this? No, I don't. But it's a great jumping off point. A lot of work was done for it. I think it's a very, very useful tool. Also, as a teacher, I like to have as much information as I can possibly have before I make any decisions. This gives me a lot of information of what people are looking for. I don't see the harm in using this or promoting this. And if we make it an official board, which I know we're just talking about today, but if we did that, then I would look to having other people who would like to be on the board, you know, just like we have for any other commission, come in and say they want to be a part of this, and let them come in. So we have a wide variety of people on it. And if the people that are on it right now who have taken some hits lately want to step down from it to let someone else come, I would certainly understand that. But I think it's a good tool. I think it's something that we can use. It's not the only tool, but it is a very useful tool for the county to have.
And with today being a discussion only, for those in the room that are getting ready to applaud for a decision, well, I hate to let you down, but that's not going to happen. We've got a lot to think about here. And yes, it's no mystery that I was a part of this. It's interesting to me, though, that I was labeled as, I think, a head of the Carroll Education Association. Never had that on my resume, so that leads me to believe that some of the folks that came in here to speak about this perhaps didn't do some of their homework. But to that degree, I have a lot to think about when it comes to this. I certainly haven't made up my mind yet, even though I'm one of the people that was involved and have been labeled as one of those people, which I'm not sure what that is. But I've got a lot to think about, and I think in the last 3 weeks you've seen that I put a little bit of thought into these decisions that I make. I just don't come off willy-nilly with whatever. But to sum this up, and we're moving into the afternoon now, I have trouble thinking about this group as a group that went against all things that we all believe in. Was it closed? Absolutely not. As a matter of fact, part of what I did was reach out to 14 fire companies in the county, and I can assure you that they are in 14 different geographical locations, in case those folks in the room don't know who they are, because but I'll let that go. But I talked to probably over 7,000 people, and remember that the folks in the fire departments are made up of all walks of life. So to imply that there wasn't some type of open communication here is, for lack of a better term, absurd. I truly think that this is something that would assist us in our long-term capital planning, our long-term growth as we look ahead. And I can't see at this point why there is a problem with bringing the folks that actually are the earpieces for everyone that lives, works, and plays in this county, and they are your community leaders, together to be able to work hand in hand with our planning and zoning. And again, I think these folks have come up to the wall now, and they can't go any further. So what they're asking is, tell us how we're going to move forward with this plan, and then we can make it work if that's how we choose. And again, that's up to us to decide whether we're going to go forward and who we're going to put on this. We might put on a whole different group of folks to take this forward. But to just say that we can't bring our community leaders together to discuss these things, and first of all to say that it was closed, to me is just ridiculous. So we've got a lot to think about. Again, this is just for discussion today, and we truly, I believe, we'll be able to get to some agreement when we all get a chance to discuss this at length between all of us.
Mr. Weaver?
The 2030 work group is a long-range issues, not planning group, but an issues group. And I think we're looking at issues down the road, and it probably should be 2040 rather than 2030 as we get going. But we have to look at the way things are going to be happening. We know there's going to be issues, and ignoring them now is not going to be good. Failing to plan is planning to fail. Every business out here looks at projections down the road, what's going to happen. They may not happen. but at least we look at the possibilities of where things are going to be. I think we need to get a jump on them. The master plan is about to come to the commissioners, and some things in the master plan I am worried about. The possibility of 60,000 lots being created from this plan would double the size of Carroll County. We need to plan for this, if that is what's going to happen in this. Now, it's 30,000, I think, lots there, but the master plan could create another 30,000 if certain things happen in a certain way. I don't think this is a planning commission at all. I think this is more of an advisory board that needs to go into the planning department as an official long-range vision process. The membership and scope should be formalized, and applicants of qualified people need to come in like any other commission. But I do give the people who served on this commission credit for taking the time and at least looking, where are we going to be way down the road? Some of us may not be around by that time, but at least we need to look at what the county's going to look like and avoid the issues before they become problems.
Well, I want to respond to some of Commissioner Howard's comments. I want to thank Commissioner Wance and Weaver and Frazier for their thoughtful comments. The question that has to be answered is, what's the harm? What's the harm? And I want to repeat something I said. As long as this was a work group advising one commissioner, there was no foul. The problem here is when we try to make something a public work group after the fact. And there are recommendations to do that. It's the recommendation sheet I received. I assume it was prepared by Commissioner Howard.
Nope.
The cover sheet.
No, it was not.
And there are several recommendations in here how we would move forward from here, complete with bylaws. And there's I think my number is correct. It recommends 24 members. Of the 24 members, 20 of them receive funding from government. 20 of the 24. There's one small business representative, one medium business, and one large business representative. I'd feel a lot better if we had a group with 20 members of government and then 20 taxpayers that are going to have to pay the bill be part of the group to offset their votes. Because when this group votes, it will bring an inherent bias. There are reasons why we don't create planning organizations consisting of government agency heads, as I said before, because they bring a bias. It's not to say they don't do their jobs well. They do their jobs very well, but they have a bias. If I'm a Chevy guy, I bring a Chevy bias. They bring a pro-government bias. And the problem is this: when we looked at the results, if this was a test, if this was a pilot, we looked at the results of this. The results were pretty damaging. And when I say damaging, when I see a group put together vision statements and recommendations that run exactly counter to everything we have been trying to do for the past 10 years, and that turned out thousands of citizens in public hearings, that's damage. And the problem is it wears our citizens down. When I talk to my constituents, and for that matter, some of your constituents too, gentlemen, they're worn out from fighting plans that try to move this county in a different direction. You know, it looks all shiny on the outside like a car, but when you open the hood, you find a frame that's bent seriously to the left. And that's what we've got here. And I would urge this Planning Commission, if it thinks that some of this work is useful, then I would suggest that we strengthen the process for the individual clusters to meet directly with the Planning and Zoning Commission rather than creating a whole separate organization, which will, again, wear our citizens down having to attend public hearings. Thank you.
All right. Well, in conclusion, I do want to correct a couple of things. One is actually planning commissions can be actually the public councils themselves, and in some cases they are all elected officials. So technically, even though we do it differently here, that's actually not the case. The bottom line is this. My intent was really something very simple. We get many decisions that come in front of us that it's very hard to decide. We just spent, what did we spend on the broadband today? Not the broadband, was it broadband? $1.1 million. Okay, $1.1 million flew through here, okay? Now, there's a lot of planning put into that, right? A lot of work went into that. I'm not suggesting that the folks that needed to do the detailed work didn't do the work. But we just spent $1 million, okay? So how many times can you spend $1 million over the course of the next 5, 10, 15 years before you say, you know what, gosh, if we had only known that this was going to be more of an issue, or that this technology might have applied better here, or that we were duplicating our efforts in a couple of places, or whatever, maybe we would have done that a little differently. Bottom line is, we want to have that discussion, don't want to have it, that's fine. To indict anybody that has been a part of this participation process is wholly unacceptable. These are folks that were chosen because of their role in the community. I didn't give them that role. I didn't make Jim McCarran, the mayor of Downeytown. I didn't make Lynn Weaver the head of the library system. I said, who are the folks that are out there? Now, the funny thing is, when we put the Education Opportunity Fund together, we went out and sought out private school and homeschool parents who were going to be the recipients of the money to ask them how to do it. But if you guys are the recipients of the money, which you're not even getting individually, you're getting in your organizations, then that's how somehow disqualifies you. If there's a theme for the day this morning, for the morning's session, sadly I think it was hypocrisy, but we're going to make a decision. We go forward fine, we don't fine, but I don't want it lost on folks that there are a lot of good folks that came together with the best of intentions that have served this community for years and years that tried to lay out what they think the concerns are. And those concerns then need to be metered out. They need to be handed over to our budget director and our public process. They need to be handed over to the Planning and Zoning Commission. But I will tell you, if you think we have vetted out the long-term concerns and questions that we have, you're wrong. We haven't done it. And we have an obligation to do it. And that's all that was intended in doing this. And I think it's amazing that after 2 years of discussion, 3 presentations, press releases, that none of this came up during the process, and now it is the hottest topic since sliced bread. I just don't understand that, but it is what it is.
Well, Commissioner Howard has eloquently and properly defended the members of the group, and his defense of all of you is valid. I think all of you do a good job in running your agencies, but I want to take objection to Commissioner Howard repeatedly referring to our citizens who are concerned about more plans being made for them, using words such as hypocrisy and hysterical paranoia. I don't believe that citizens who are concerned about their freedoms being usurped should be labeled as hysterical or paranoia.